We're all set.
All set?
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Okay.
No, it's Meet TV, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So public
recording?
access. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so it's recorded.
Picture.
Yeah.
You get a lot of weekly or monthly viewers.
Yeah.
We don't get a lot of views.
Gotta look good for the neighbors.
We do get the occasional person that asks for something that happened or was said in the meeting. And that's
Right.
really why we do it. It's easier than writing things down.
Got it.
For sure.
Okay, well, we can call to order then at 6:01. Would you mind?
Yeah, I'll
And there's
try.
not a lot to start
Hopefully.
with. Okay, so 6:01, call to order. And then we have an interesting meeting tonight where this is, I think, is a joint meeting with the New Haven Conservation
Do you want more
Commission.
paper than that, or are you okay?
Sure.
I don't want to encourage verbosity.
I was already
And so mostly we just wanted to focus on a discussion about wildlife tracking and trying to think about how we can update the next Bristol Town Plan. That's what we were originally thinking, and then start thinking about wildlife doesn't know about town boundaries, and so we should bring some more voices into the conversation. So we'll be moving on to that that is like the only agenda item we really have to discuss. Very quickly, is there a public comment that is not related to an item on the agenda? Okay. Is there any additional items we should add to the agenda? All right. Should we review and approve the minutes from July 14th because we skipped our August meeting?
We could table that.
We can table it.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. Okay, we have a second on the tabling.
Second.
And then we're gonna go to old business. Okay, so now we can talk about it. So, Kristen, you wanna
Sure.
go for it?
Sure. So thank you all for coming, and especially Sophie from, I think, is it Richmond, or where did you come from?
Jeffersonville these days.
Jeffersonville
actually,
these
so yeah,
days.
It's a bit of a drive, a nice one though.
Excellent. Well, thank you for taking the time to come down and join us. This is a joint meeting. We have one rep from sort of from the New Haven Conservation Commission. You're an aspiring member, is that true?
Yes, I'm going to this upcoming September meeting.
Okay, great.
We'll hopefully we can remember that. Yes.
Cool. Susan Smiley, the vice chair, couldn't be here tonight, but Dave, she thought, would be making it, so he may show up. Then we also have Mary Dodge from the Cornwall Conservation Commission. And then we can go around and introduce ourselves from the commission. I'm Kristen, the vice chair.
Helen Young.
From Bristol Conservation Commission.
Nancy Morrison
From Bristol.
from Bristol.
Amos Martin from Bristol.
An interested citizen. An avid wildlife tracker.
That's right. Awesome. See some of your photos. And I'm Carolyn Dash, and I'm the current chair. That's cool.
So, just by way of background, we were approached by a number of citizens who wanted us to think about expanding our wildlife tracking and inventorying for the town, specifically to update the town plan. We do have some wildlife corridor maps in our current town plan that was approved in 2021, but those maps are based on data that was about 20 years old. And we know that in Bristol we've had lots of development along our secondary roads here in town, particularly in the last 20 years or so. And there's a feeling that that may have shifted the patterns of wildlife movement and changed the habitat that they have available to them. And so we've been in a kind of information gathering phase over the last couple of months, I guess, to understand how we might gather more information, more current information about our wildlife resources here in town, what consultants are available to us, such as yourself, to supply some of those services, what grants are available to us as a town, how we might collaborate with our neighboring towns like Cornwall and New Haven to kind of be more effective with our limited resources, and also acknowledging that wildlife don't follow town boundaries, they follow watershed boundaries and other things like that. So I've been gathering some information which I can share with the commission, but I think our main purpose for tonight's meeting was to hear from you, Sophie, in terms of what your expertise is and how you have helped other towns in this same situation, and what services you can provide and what grant programs you might be able to recommend for us. So,
Great.
take it away.
Well, thanks all. It's great to be here. I feel like I should have made a PowerPoint presentation or something. But yeah, I started diving professionally into the world of wildlife tracking almost, a decade ago or 7, 8 years ago, and it's really a passion, and particularly wanting to apply that, ability to recognize wildlife tracks and sign to a better understanding of how to manage for wildlife habitat, right? 'Cause wildlife just, bobcats and bears don't have a seat at this table here to say, hey, save this bit of green space for me. So that really is like my primary, driving interest. My background spans, a lot of environmental education and outreach and community science project management, in addition to spending all my spare time tracking wildlife, just about being a certified tracker. And so the municipalities that I've worked with in tracking efforts are Burlington and South Burlington. That's where I lived for the better part of the last decade, minus a couple of years stint out in Seattle, where I also contributed to some tracking projects in the Cascades. So I've worked in both urbanized areas and wild areas, trying to track down wolves and wolverines and the like. Oftentimes, it's interesting. I've been doing some background reading and looking at what's Moncton been up to, what's New Haven been up to, what's going on, especially with Act 171, right, and forest fragmentation and preservation of wildlife corridors, really in front of everybody's minds as far as having those wildlife maps. And it feels like this really tricky problem to solve, because you want to be able to really define your corridors well, and it's tough to do that, right? Because a deer goes different places than a turkey, than a bobcat, than a bear, and you name the animal, and of course you can try to draw some generalized patterns. But it does kind of raise that question of well, how do you get that fine-grained knowledge of these locations? The town's a big area to try to track. And at the state level, really, they've been trying to address, Vermont conservation design. Are you familiar with BioFinder and the conservation design framework? There's resources that you can access. There's staff expertise you can access at a state level. That's all based on modeling, right? And there's a lot of maps that say here are all the suspected corridors. But a lot of that is really just looking at here's forest on one side of the road, here's forest on the other side. Yeah, that'll do.
Yeah.
So even just getting on the ground, that was my experience in Burlington. I really just set out in South Burlington to recruit volunteer trackers and update their 20-year-old plan and just put wildlife sightings on the map. And so this is a very worn copy of a map, and make some nice visuals of okay, here's at least where foxes or bobcats or fishers and otters have been seen in town, and that's just one way to approach it, right? Because this can vary based on the amount of effort that's put into visiting these places. This varies. Obviously based on habitat features and by species, so you can start to draw some patterns, but you're always constrained by the amount of time you can spend in the field, the amount of expertise.
Was this from citizen reporting through an app or something?
So the origin of this, so I kicked off the Burlington Mammal Tracking Project in 2015, and I think there's thousands of sightings that have been contributed now. So citizen reporting, what happened that first winter, and I was just doing this as part of a wildlife tracking apprenticeship, program of study that I was taking with a school out of Maine. I was invited into a project, and my friend Alicia Daniel, who I studied with in UVM's field naturalist program, we were out for a walk, and she said, well, it kind of feels like we should revamp the report that she made in 2000 for Burlington of wildlife corridor maps, because they were very, very dated at that point. And so our goal was to get people out and just try to put wildlife presence on the map and try to interpret wildlife corridors to a degree from there. It's a little different in Burlington than here, right? Because Burlington, you've got these micro corridors of here's the 100 feet of forest that are left that connects Red Rocks to Oak Lodge Park. So it's different than where you've got lots of forest that maybe getting fragmented, but yeah. So the previous maps were at a very first level. So what happened with with this project and trying to get these wildlife sightings on the map was that I decided to create a project on iNaturalist. That's often my recommendation to anybody that I'm working with on programs like this now, just because there are so many wildlife trackers, so many skilled naturalists on that platform. And you raised the great question of, wildlife don't follow town boundaries, right? So I quickly discovered that really the Burlington Tracking Project was also a South Burlington and a Winooski and a Colchester and these other towns too. And my recommendation now is if you get wildlife sightings or wildlife track and sign sightings on the map, the key really is to be able to take good documentation. And so that's something that I can teach as a tracker and educator. How do you photograph tracks? How do you interpret a trail or a scene? What's going on there, so that you can say, like, absolutely that was a bobcat. Because tracks can look snowed in, right? Sometimes you just get like a little glimpse. Of a single track at the side of the road, or sometimes you have a full trail. And it can be a years long, a lifetime practice to try to build up that skill to be able to interpret. But it can be a quicker process to get people up to the point where they can document enough that somebody could verify that sighting. And so the beautiful thing about iNaturalist is there's a lot of pros on there and a lot of people who like to spend some of their free time going and verifying and saying, like, yeah, absolutely, that's a red fox and not a gray fox, or this is a bear track. Yeah. And so that kind of gives you a shortcut to give your sightings what's called a research grade status on that platform, which is a kind of course way to say, like, yeah, those are sightings that I can trust because at least a couple of people have backed up the report. Not 100% accurate, but it's a good starting point. So what I quickly found was that I wanted to personally verify every single sighting, but as those numbers climb into the thousands, it's hard to do. It's very hard to keep up, right? So if you can outsource it to people who enjoy others. Doing it and have the expertise, it's a really great way to do it.
Cool. So I can imagine there could be a citizen base of interested folks. You could teach us how to collect, as you said, the best way to document those sightings, and then there'd be this other tier of more expert trackers who could then view that information and verify it. And those trackers could be in Oregon, they could be in Ontario, they could be here in Vermont. So there's collaboration that could be going on and people visiting those sightings and all verifying each other's, say just within the town here, or it could also be getting outsourced to others. And then I can provide a degree, like depending on if you were to pursue a consulting relationship, then I would be looking to verify the accuracy of those sightings too.
Alexis Mikhaila's mammalogy class and her environmental studies classes already do this around campus. Oh, cool. Every student has to do a handful and they have to get them verified.
Yeah.
So cool. We have some of the data within the last semester.
Neat.
That's great, yeah. And then the tricky part is figuring out, directing sampling efforts. Like in the case of Burlington, South Burlington, I recruited a group of about a dozen more experienced trackers and just kind of looking at target locations on the map, whether it was ones identified by the state as priority crossings or just other locations of interest, like just based on my knowledge and local naturalist knowledge, hunter knowledge, wildlife lovers, you name it. I assigned people towards priority locations, and that you can come up with different protocols, but one would simply be to try to walk a transect, which might be a mile's length of road if you're interested in a potential road crossing area, and then usually go out after every major snowfall. So you want to give a couple of days for animals to move after a big snow event, and then be going and surveying after that. Burlington, South Burlington, the winter of 2015-16 was super tricky because we had hardly any snow cover. so that protocol fell apart, and but I started digging up other data sources, and it's always interesting to see what else is out there, whether it's radio collared bobcat records from state wildlife biologists, or grad students, local hunter, woodsman, woodsperson knowledge. Just trying to tap into all of those sources too to guide the efforts. So,
do you utilize game cameras at all in the non-snowy months, or?
Yeah, absolutely, and track and sign sightings in the non-snowy months too, right? So especially, deer trails are identifiable at just about any time of year, except when the leaves are actively falling on the ground. Not on every possible surface, but you can go looking for those signs, and then placing game cameras to verify sightings too. So I've led several camera trapping projects, and in the years that the Burlington, like right now the Burlington, South Burlington is kind of on cruise control because people just continue to contribute sightings.
Right. So you set the program up a few years back, but now it's migrated into just it's steady state. It's operating on its own. Yeah.
It's provided some initial information, and I will say too, I moved out to Seattle a few years after this started for a couple of years. So if I had stayed in town and like, you know, stayed on top of what we might have found like other collaborations, but we basically built up such a data set that there is a good starting amount of knowledge.
Yeah.
Something that I find that I can offer, 'cause it always feels to me like there's a trade-off between like wanting to engage lots of people and you know, just and get that effort versus tracking expertise, right? So you can train people to recognize and you know tell a domestic dog track from a coyote track. But you know, obviously, the more time people have spent outside, the more experience you have tracking. I would say almost the more that intuition or just ability to read a landscape and anticipate, like, oh, that ridge line, you know, there's potential, or, you know, there's something about this location here that I see on the map, or, you know, something that you see on the ground can play into it. And so I've always wrestled with that, you know, do you put your efforts into training lots of people, or do you just say, actually, you know, myself, or maybe 1 to 2 to 3 other trained trackers or professionals would be better off just going out and trying to cover all that ground, which isn't very scalable, right? Because like I want to be helping every town to go through this, but I think that there is value in getting onto the town, and something that's not represented on some of these maps that I've made for Burlington and South Burlington are some of the trailing efforts. So my personal process, and I realized like my approach to wanting to discover wildlife movement across these cities was to get out on the ground, find a carnivore trail, and follow it. Obviously having to deal with property lines and posted land and all of that, but where possible, to go out and follow it. And of course, you know, a single trail, it's anecdotal, right? But I think each trail can be really, really informative. And especially if you go out and follow those trails, you know, it takes respect and like understanding that when you're pushing an animal, or like, you know, back trailing instead of forward trailing, if it could be a sensitive time of year or sensitive area that you're going into. So just wanting to be really cautious of that. But you know, being able to, it's hard to put good visualizations on the maps, but if I could draw all the spaghetti lines, you know, of like, here's where a fisher connected from here to here, here's where a bobcat came through town, I think those stories are, you know, can be really informative. And the question always comes down to then, like, how do you turn that one story of that trail into an actionable management recommendation, right? That would like hold up in courts, that would, hold up to scrutiny. So that's, you know, something that I'm continuing to want to face and work with different towns and just, you know, actively figure out.
Right. I spoke with, and I'm going to mispronounce his name, Jens Hilke?
Yeah, Jens Hilke.
Okay, Hilke. Is it 2 syllables in the
I think
last
so.
name? I'm not sure.
Hilke, I think it is Hilke. It is 2 syllables. So it's either Hilke or Hilke. I used to teach his kids at a forest school in Burlington, so I would see Jens all the time. Yeah.
Cool.
I think it's Hilke.
Hilke,
At least he hasn't told me to stop calling it.
Okay. So he's worked with your town as well, Cornwall.
Yeah.
And he's come to New Haven, and I think he called it pre-filter, GIS pre-filter sites. Like he did a remote sensing view of New Haven and identified key locations, crossing locations that might want to be observed, and can offer a similar kind of service to Bristol. Maybe he did the same for Cornwall. I'm not sure. He spoke very highly of you, by the way. He said your work is outstanding. And was excited that we had contacted you. He mentioned kind of a 2-prong approach of the wildlife tracking as you've been describing, and a program to get citizens interested and engaged in that. And it also natural communities mapping effort, and then the 2 combined can often be more powerful. The wildlife tracking, it sounds like, needs a few seasons or a few years to build up the data, whereas the natural resource mapping can occur within a grant cycle, which is often the constraint that we're under. For example, of a municipal planning grant that we've been talking to some other towns about as well. And I didn't know if you had any thoughts about that, about the combination of the 2.
Those 2.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, my bias or passion is definitely around tracking larger animals, and those are the ones that are easy to track. But I will say that, like, you know, these sightings are all of, well, it's deer and moose and bear and bobcat, so larger mammals.
Right.
You know, mink and otters, like having riparian species as well, to look at that kind of connectivity. But yeah, it does ignore, that's not everything, right?
Right.
Right, reptiles and amphibians and
Mice.
Mice.
Little mammals.
Yeah, well,
Little guys.
well, and so the approach, the idea with tracking the larger mammals is viewing them as umbrella species. Are you familiar with that term? So, you know, like the idea there is that if you're protecting a corridor for a bobcat, that you're also going to be protecting a corridor for mice and for cottontails and voles. You know, everything that uses that bobcat corridor. It's not perfect, right? But generally, like, you know, usually the larger carnivores, so bear, bobcat, fisher,
Right.
can work well that way. And I would say that, you know, fisher and bobcat would be two great study species. Fortunately, too, like some of my tracking colleagues have done studies and found that the models, if you try to model where you think a fisher might go, it often does match up on the ground with where you find those fisher tracks.
Okay.
Of course, depending on the particular model being used, so it gives me hope that
The models
you know,
are
the
useful.
modeling is a good, you know, starting point anyway. But even just getting on the ground and not knowing anything about wildlife tracking too, if you visit some of those you know, pre-filtered locations that Jens has pointed out, or if you just look on the map, you know, sometimes fence lines, culverts, just things that you don't see from that aerial Google Maps view are going to come out like front and center as soon as you're on the ground. And you know, maybe it's like, oh no, this is actually a really crummy spot for you to move if you're a bobcat because of whatever reason.
Right.
So yeah, definitely ground truthing, right? Getting on the ground and visiting those locations, and then trying to gather as much data as possible about wildlife movement there.
Yep.
Yeah. But so I guess all that to say that yes, you know, tracking just covers one thing. So you know, to be able to combine that with natural communities assessment, with any data that can be gathered or is known, say about reptile and amphibian crossings or movements, that's not going to be captured in a carnivore tracking effort.
Right. Right.
And any other sources, right? You can't just lean on this.
Sure. Are there other questions from Cornwall and New Haven, and maybe you want to share a little bit about what you've been doing in your towns and how it might dovetail with Bristol, or?
Yeah, so it feels like I'm a part of the conversation. So it's some of the things that we're talking about kind of fit with what Cornwall did. So we did have an inventory of the town, but the part that was least satisfactory for me, because that was the fact that the wildlife was only speculative. So what our consultant did was he had a pre-inventory session where people came in and they shared information about natural areas in town, wildlife, that kind of thing. So we gathered that information for the whole town, whatever, you know, whether it was your backyard or what it was, that he gathered that. And then he went into a remote mode to decide which of the areas that people talked about, plus maybe some they hadn't, he was going to field verify. And he did that. And he did also then present that data. And I brought the map, but I don't know how helpful this is going to be.
And who is he? Is this?
His name is Brett Engstrom.
Oh yeah. Okay.
So, can you guys see this?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So this is Cornwall. This is Middlebury. This is oh golly, this is Bridport, and Weybridge would be up here, and New Haven's not on it. That just shows you how where this connection would be. So this is the swamp. Okay, so we're blessed with the town is very fragmented. It's reverting back from farms. You know, it's such a fascinating little spot. It's the valley, so we have tremendous amount of wildlife, but it also feels so fragile because there's so much things that are changing and so little understanding of what are the key important things. But anyway, so the green spots are the identified areas he found that were forest blocks of natural important significance. Then he did some speculative stuff about what people suggested in that green interface, where they've seen it, which was really good because we put a push on to get the hunters of the town and other people who would have that local knowledge come. And then he also added some of his own. But he said in the inventory, quite honestly, this needs verification. So the other thing that's spread all over town is at the cameras that I've had out for the last 2.5 years. And
Are those the red dots, or?
Well, the red dots are the cameras, the blue dots are the pictures that have come in about things, and the yellow dots are people saying things, but I don't have the pictures.
Got it.
So this is like a 2-year, and you can see that. But you know, quite honestly, one of the reasons I'm here is I'm not sure where to go with this. I'm not sure how strong the data it is. And I know whenever I go in and we have a process where the Conservation Commission gives feedback on subdivisions, when I go in and discuss this, it's really tricky because the Vermont Conservation Design is on a big scale, and our pathways, our connected things are on a small scale. And so I have to, we go in and, you know, okay, this one isn't on the Vermont Conservation Design, but we just had a development right there, and so it's the northern end of the swamp going over, and you know, it's really kind of an important thing, but we really worked hard to try to articulate in a way that sounded like we knew what we were doing. And then at one point, the developer said, "Now, if I understand it, you're saying this is likely."
Oh, wow.
And I said, yeah, because we didn't have that next step. So, Sophia, I don't know whether you ever get to a next step, but this is kind of what we've been doing to try to wander around the question, hoping that enlightenment will somehow.
Well, it sounds like iNaturalist or Seek, right, and to get data that way could be really helpful.
Yes, and we they have created a site especially for the data here, but if you enter data into the site we created, you also enter it to the larger site. So that was connected with that.
This makes sense.
So you've done a lot already.
Yeah, sounds like it.
Well,
it's amazing, yeah.
Well,
That's great.
but we're not to the point of having anything that we can count on.
Or
Or
do you,
sell.
do you mean in terms of influencing town planning and
Decision making, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, or like putting up like wildlife crossing sign or something,
Yeah,
right?
well, they're working on the town plan, which is wonderful. It's motivated by Act 171. We're talking about overlay districts, and the overlay districts that they suggested, the Planning Commission suggested, were only Vermont Conservation Design districts. So that was like 2 or 3 spots. That's not.
It's not at the scale where you're seeing the wildlife.
No, I'm blocking
Oh, yeah.
Permanent question.
That was my experience in Burlington as well, that you know, especially in such a developed area, that sometimes it was such a narrow corridor, right? And you know, it could be like a single landowner, or like in the case, there's a connection between like, you know, Red Rocks and Oak Ledge, so we're talking about like 100 acres of woods that gives way to like another, you know, 60, and it's like snaking through backyards, and then another connection to the Potash Brook corridor, but and it's, you know, like a strip of woods that nobody would give a second glance at, but if that like one little strip is removed that's all of like 10 yards wide, then maybe there's, you know, the connectivity's gone, or at least like that preferred travel route right now for fishers, for deer, for foxes that are moving through there.
Yeah.
But it is really hard to turn to a town then and say like, yeah, no, we absolutely can't put a house on that corner because fishers come by on a, I don't know, like every 7 weeks kind of basis, right? Like, so the issue comes down to, and I'm so curious to like continue pushing and talking to people at the state and hearing about different town experiences, because the issue comes down to like, how do you define wildlife corridors in a way that can pull back, right? Like, what is that threshold? Is it just that there's more activity than other places in town? Is there a certain amount of carnivore pass-bys or deer pass-bys or mouse, like, you know, there's just so many different ways that
or if it's the only crossing on a route for miles and miles either direction.
Right, yeah, and if that's the case, then that feels very easy to argue, and yeah, oftentimes there's more dispersed movement.
But then also to her point, how much data do you need to prove that, right? Because you say, well, it's likely, and there's developments everywhere else for miles around, that won't necessarily hold up if someone wants to build something there. Right, so what's the minimum level of data that's required to actually be persuasive in those sorts of discussions?
And with a little, so just a little sense of how works. So this particular development I just mentioned, we weighed in on it 3 times. The first time, it was interesting because 2 adjacent landowners were at the meeting. One was on the planning commission, and both adjacent landowners said, "Oh yeah, there are a lot of animals that go here. You know, oh yeah, they're always." So then the next time we weighed in, we said, "And the adjacent landowner," but it was like, you know, pulling teeth to create a clarity which we thought was there. And I also had trail cam data, but that was so hard. Golly.
You had trail camera evidence?
I did have on the one particular corner. One of the neighbors is a friend, so we had put a camera out, and so I could take the 2-month sampling and put down the things that, you know, that I had recorded, because I would look at the camera disc and say, okay, the year, 2, the day, and the time, keep going. So I had that whole list, including some a couple lovely winter pictures, which I think probably meant more than the absolute list. But
I'm coming in late to the meeting here, but I thought of an analogy. So if you're a budding landowner and there's some potential for a development of a parcel, then there's a whole zoning set of ordinances which have to be satisfied, and you can go to a meeting and you can state your case as to why you think it's good or bad, or maybe someone's indifferent but they just want to attend a meeting. There seems to me that there should be something equivalent that is, of course, people have private land, so you can't necessarily take private land, even though it has this value ecologically, and tell somebody what to do with it if they maybe want to consider developing it. But there should be some oversight, some ability to put it within a zoning, because that's what people sort of are used to. That's what they understand. I'm not saying that's the best solution, but it seems like a model that's already in place. If you also take another analogy, which is animals can be on the extinct list, right? And then there's some that are threatened, and then there's, you know, various levels. Endangered. Thank you, Carolyn. We don't want any extinct. There isn't a list of those that are extinct. Yeah, sorry. I have too many thoughts going and jumbling here. So, so there needs to be, you know, I mean, we're here, we care, but there's so many pressures, and once it's blacktopped over, once it's built up, it's more or less gone for a very long period of time. And I always say this to people: New York City was a series of farms, and before that it was Native Americans. And what is it now? And so, and where's the best farmland? It's usually built on and near good waterways for back in the day when there was just water power. So that's the model that is, we're stuck with it, and it just keeps going on, and you know, there's always development pressure. So I'm not so...
So maybe the flip side of this, or maybe just looking at it slightly differently, do we have any evidence that the Planning Commission or the Zoning Commission cares about wild habitat?
Well, it's written in our town plan.
Yeah. And what is written? What
Do you have it?
I did.
Well, this is General Chapin, by the way. He's on the BCC.
So in our natural resources section of the Bristol Town Plan, under goals and policies, there are 4 goals that address wildlife in some way. Maintain healthy contiguous forest blocks for public recreation, sustainable forestry production, and the movement of wildlife. Support agriculture capable of producing a variety of food, pasture, and livestock while providing open landscape and wildlife connectivity. And then the next 2 goals are a little less directly related to
But
wildlife.
that first one is very clear.
It's pretty clear.
Okay.
And is that something that's supposed to be actionable by the Conservation Commission, Planning Commission, in conjunction? Do you know what part it came out of?
I was going to look for that chart, you know,
Okay,
that
yeah, the
has
chart,
all those,
yeah.
and I just, the day got away from me, I
maybe
forgot.
someone else.
But that's a
okay.
goal, an enabling that's the enabling language that those strategies would be attached to. So I just need to look
I don't want to sound cynical, but I would venture to say that most towns that are on the ball, and obviously larger towns, have something to some degree of this in their town plan. Whether or not it's seriously, thought about, or it's just a platitude of sorts, that's where I think the metal has to, the rubber has to meet the road and so on, is that, as I said, I believe we're all sitting here because we care deeply about this stuff and we can see out into the future, but there are vast development pressures and they're just looking at that dollar and they don't care.
So Sophie is with the Trekking Connection, and she was just telling us about her work in Burlington, South Burlington, Winooski, and how they've been trying to track movement, but it's hard because where does that become legislation or policy or
Right, exactly.
So she was just telling us about that.
With a certain definition, you can turn up at any development hearing and say, well, that's a wildlife corridor because it is a wildlife corridor for something, right? But so I think the key is actually, and this is the kind of thing that should hold teeth.
Is documenting?
To document and then to delineate, a certain number, right? Like if you show up at every development hearing and say, no, you can't do this, the wildlife, right? That dilutes the protection, or makes it a harder case when it's that one key remaining road crossing that is being frequented by a lot of animals, or that goes towards a vernal pool that's in use, or those sorts of things. So being able to hone in on priority areas, I think, is incredibly powerful. And then of course having the data to back it up. But it is interesting how things go. I've shown up at town meetings in Burlington, South Burlington, and felt like I'm not like an absolute wildlife expert, but certainly the expert in the room, and then everyone that just turns to you and says, okay, where's the corridor then? Or like, what should we do here? Like, should a fence go in? Should this not? So I think often, towns are just dealing with the best information that they have, and going from there. But yeah, it can be really hard though when there's strong development pressure. And I mean, we all need houses too, right? So like, I think it's easy to demonize the big bad developer.
But we all live in a house too, yeah.
Yeah. So.
But I know for me, it would be nice to really know what I'm protecting, apart from whether I can convince anybody else. And we are working on that. I mean, and that is certainly another part of it. But that knowledge, I really think I am at the likely. And that doesn't seem like enough, Sophie. Is it enough to say likely? No, I don't think so.
No, it helps to say with certainty that, this is a road where, every year bears are crossing to go feed in these wetlands, or this, that's where, the mom takes her cubs and puts them up the pine trees to go feed in this area, or those are the rocky ledges where bobcats are denning. Again, it sometimes being tricky, right? Because we can think of those as umbrella species. None of those species is threatened or endangered, so you can't use that as justification. It's really just saying, we're trying to preserve the overall forest connectivity or wetland riparian connectivity for the movements of those animals and everything else that would fall within their territories too. And so yes, the more intimacy that you gain with a place, the more that you have knowledge of local wildlife, whether it's through tracking or trail camera footage, any time in the field, any informed time in the field, the better you can stand on that. So I would say actually, like, in the case of where Cornwall's at, well, thanks to Brett's efforts, thanks to your efforts, this is a great set of areas for continued monitoring, right? To have honed in on those areas initially, and so, now could be the continuing citizen engagement time to just build that up.
So in terms of what those steps would be, how do you other people at the state that we could talk to about, like, what would you need, or what what best practices, or how do you get a wildlife crossing sign? I don't know, anything like actionable. Like, what can you do? Like, okay, so we can talk about the data. We talked a little bit about how to gather it. We have some ideas, right? What then, right? Like, how do we put that into a town plan? Or who do you think we could talk to answer that question for us, right? Any ideas? Anyone? Like, what's next? Like, we can go out and do that part, theoretically. But then what's the next theoretical step, right? Before we put language in a town plan.
Seems like part of the question you're asking is, like, what are the resources out there to...
Yeah, well, that would be like a budget question. I guess I'm asking, what do we even do next, right? What do we even want? How do we do it? What kind of, like, do we have maps of likelihood of where animals are that we could put in a town plan? Like, what could we actually create or do that would be
Are there people
deliverable?
Are there people out there that help establish a baseline of animal, wildlife in an area, and then you can build upon that after year upon year and so on, because it's kind of a race against time in a way. The pressures that are out there.
I guess I'm just trying to figure out what's a useful deliverable and who could help us think about what that might be.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, those are separate questions. I mean, maps are powerful. For better or worse, being able to show footage of some cute bear cubs, it can be really powerful too, and that's often the way that people are swayed, right? When it's public sentiment or community sentiment that's really coming into play. But I would say being able to come up with maps that are a step beyond this, right? This is wildlife sightings where I never got to because I volunteered my time towards this effort rather than being engaged or finding the grant funding to actually turn it into discrete corridors. The next step on this map though would be to actually map the very discrete corridors, and it this seems fairly discrete. It can drive me a little bit nuts. I was trying to find the previous corridors that were mapped for Burlington in here, because they were basically just giant gray arrows that covered almost half the city. So it's basically saying things like, well, the lake shore is a corridor. Right?
And then we hand that to planning commission, select board, and what do they do with it, right? And so I want to see.
Is there any evidence that any planning commission or zoning commission has used any information like this and changed their plan?
I'm sure Sophie knows more, but
because if there aren't any, then I'm not sure why we're doing it.
I think Weybridge has explored the idea of overlaid districts, and you may know of other towns.
I'm going to venture to say that I know a gentleman, Bill Roper, who I believe is pretty involved in Weybridge. So if you have a stakeholder that has quite a bit of sway, that's where you're going to see a lot of traction. And I'm pretty sure that's because of Bill and probably some others. And he's very good at galvanizing groups. And so that's the critical mass element of when this stuff starts to be meaningful.
I keep thinking you're raising your
hand.
hand.
Sorry, I just
it's fine.
We're working on
I know, right?
So the goals and the new town plan is in process, and we have worked really intensively with the planning commission, and so they're getting more specific. They're talking about overlay districts and putting that in as a goal, and they've taken into the plan care for preserving the forest blocks, so that's been integrated in. But okay, so we're in the process of having some steps that, if approved, then would that this documentation would go into the zoning. And the subdivision regulations, and that we would ask, and so here's, and then another goal is that the applicant, whenever possible, will observe or honor this. I don't, that's not the word that used, but if possible. And so that, if you've got a map, see, this is where I'm at. If you got a map and you got that, then it's on their shoulders to make that determination. You don't take it away from them, but you ask them to come
consider
forward.
it.
Yeah, so that's kind of where we are. We haven't achieved that yet because you have your various bodies, and some people are and some people say, I smell, somebody who's going to try to, not let me do what I want to do with my property. So it'll be interesting to see, and probably know by the end of the summer. Well, no, we're at the end of the summer, New Year, whether this will go through, because it's got to go with the planning commission, the hearings. The select board was the problem the last time, and many of the people are still there. But that was, so I could share that with, people in terms of how we are trying to put together the concrete language that allows you then to ask your zoning commissioner to look at those things. And it really even has to go smaller than your subdivision, because your subdivisions are meant, but most development occurs in your lot. And so if you have a forest area that's important in your lot, do you dive into it, or do you, and can you encourage the landowner to think about that and sort of make that determination if it's important?
So I have one small thing I want to say, and then I think I have to leave. But we talked the last time about potentially getting together with a couple towns and applying for a municipal planning grant. And I haven't done any time looking at terms of reference for such a thing. But one of the things we can think about is if this would be allowed under the scope of what we can ask for grant money for, is we can ask for grant money to help us do the research to figure out what are the best practices around how to help. Because a municipal planning grant is obviously helping municipalities develop plans, but also actionable plans. And so helping think through what are the best practices in order to help towns understand how they can incorporate this amongst all the other considerations they have to do when it comes to planning and zoning. And so maybe that's something we can actually ask for money for, because we're all kind of struggling with how does this get balanced, and how do we turn it from this lovely word in a town plan that no one reads to something which is actually considered when decisions are being made. So just an idea. I'm sorry I have to go, but
It's a great idea. Thank you for coming.
my pleasure.
Yep, thank you.
Would you mind, is that the 20-year out-of-date term? Could you tell us a little bit about, maybe do you know where it came from, or what we could improve on that, or some about the previous work, or the state we're at?
Yeah, so the map that's presently in the Bristol Town Plan of wildlife corridors and connectivity on page 98 came from a 2002-2003 study done by the Lewis Creek Association in the Lewis Creek watershed. And it's my understanding that when we generated our town plan, Andrew LaRoe at Addison County Regional Planning Commission looked to that source map and plotted on this map of Bristol the black bear and the bobcat corridors. And so it's not a lot of detail, but it's better than no map at all. And so I think we're discussing now ways that we could improve upon this map, maybe by expanding to other species beyond bear and bobcat, but also by adding a little more granularity to the map and producing something that looks more like what you brought from Cornwall. And I think Bristol's at a point where before we can talk about how we use this data and in order to influence planning and zoning, we have to collect the data. And
but we don't know what data to collect.
Well,
do we?
I
Like, if we don't know what it's where we're our impact is?
I think there are people out there,
mean,
Sue
obviously
Morse and so on, that
and Sophie that
that
can teach tracking and
I mean, I think we do know what data to collect. I have natural communities assessment and
wildlife tracking.
That's what I was referring to as a baseline.
Done.
I mean, you can always build upon
Yeah.
it, but you got to start, and create some bottom point of reference.
So what Jens recommended today to me was a municipal planning grant could be applied for. They're about a year in length, and so that's a sufficient timeline to do the natural communities mapping, essentially defining the habitats that the critters move within, right, in between. At the same time, we could be hiring a consultant to help train interested citizens in wildlife tracking, and not only just wildlife tracking, but in the best practices of documentation that could then be, I guess, verified by expert trackers through iNaturalist. And so I think we'd be getting two sets of data simultaneously, the natural communities mapping.
If I could throw in an
and the
idea for a
corridor.
third set, though, to also do, like you said, with community engagement, printing off the maps, getting groups, after church, before, with the fire department, just the library, the school, get different groups of people, try to get them to input, 6 people at a time with different color markers. Okay, this is what I've seen here, here, here. And then we can put those together.
An organizational meeting like you all had initially.
I was thinking that we can try to get to the stakeholders, though, to get to the people in different places in their comfort zone and try to pull those voices out and say if we can get, maybe from the community to say what's your experience? Because a concern that I have that you brought up is where is the effort made, and then where do you see things, right? So like, I might have like, oh, there's so many amazing things in my backyard because I'm looking for them, right? So it's like, then my house is preserved, but not someone else's house who didn't come to that meeting, right? So I think we need to think about where everyone is and see how we can pull the community in to have that shared voice, and then there's shared ownership of the project as well. So I would make a push, since they also already did it, that would be something important. And I just was at ESA, Ecological Society of America annual meeting, and there's a lot of push for that. So I just wanted, it was a best practice I heard a lot about with animal tracking.
The best practice of, you mean reaching everyone? Like,
reaching everyone in the community and getting community involvement through big paper maps, talking about it. Or having something from March 4, people can like enter things in. Some kind of a community map, like we've done before for the town hall meeting day with the stickers. We've
done old-fashioned pinpricks.
Yeah, just a way to get like buy-in from the community. So then when it's in the town plan in 4 years, it's not this, well, what is this? You know, you brought some expert in. I don't know, Alex would know where things are that I wouldn't know, right? So, because he knows where all the animals are. Everyone's like, Kevin! Hey!
And does only public land matter?
I have no idea.
It seems to me that if it's private land, zoning, it's beyond the zoning commission. It's already private. They can do with it whatever they want, or not?
Not necessarily.
Okay,
so it's important then to do all.
I'd say it's important to consider all, and then as far as where you place effort, if you have areas that are already conserved, right, whether it's federal lands or VLT or Nature Conservancy, then those are probably important wildlife corridors or core habitats. But if they're already permanently protected, then you place less effort there, at least within those areas, but look towards connections to those areas. So, so actually, like, personally, if someone just handed me the time or money to tackle this on my own, I would probably, first turn to maps, right? Try to gather all the existing resources, and that would be looking at the forest blocks, stuff that's available from the state priority forest blocks, but smaller forest patches too, though, right? At a state level, what's tier 1 and 2, there could be something that's really important to local wildlife that just isn't showing up on that short list. And then looking at the priority crossings that have been identified, and then getting on the ground, trying to drive that whole area, and then also overlaying what are the protected areas on the maps. And then, getting on the ground from there, just with dirt time and talking to people who put in a lot of dirt time. And then trying to, with probably a multi-pronged approach, right, of like getting out for directed surveying efforts, I'd say like personal surveying efforts, as well as trying to crowdsource that data, right, whether it's inviting the whole town to contribute through a naturalist or through another community platform, something that will engage as many people as possible, is what I would look to do. And then the key piece, and I think where the most professional interpretation comes in, is then translating all of that into corridors that are very clearly delineated to say, like, yes, these are those priority areas, and making sure that it's not just the person who had the loudest voice in the room, right? So trying to parse and then hopefully having the camera footage, the track records to back it up. But I don't know, anybody who spends a lot of time in the woods, sometimes you just like know that there's something special about a place, and it's hard to like exactly define why. But you could say natural communities mapping is important. It feels very separate to me. I mean, it's obviously like part of the whole natural resource assessment of a place, but different as far as informing wildlife, because when you're looking at corridors, you're usually looking at those larger ranging, more generalist species, right? Like a bobcat may want to den on rocky cliff ledges that face towards the southwest, but they're also going to cover a lot of ground in varied habitats. So, so a bobcat may not care if they're in a northern hardwood forest or a cold air talus woodland at the base of Bristol cliffs. Like it's all part of their
hunting in a cornfield.
It's exactly right. Like a little hedgerow. Like I always wonder, like, okay, well the bobcat's moving along this hedgerow, and that's actually really significant because they want cover. But would they be just as likely to move through a brand new hedgerow that was planted somewhere else? Right? Like, is it important to protect that hedgerow, or is it important to have
a hedgerow?
Right. And so, like, some cover. Although existing forest, older forest is important. And then looking at landscape features too. Like, I would want to put on the map where are there mast stands, right? Are there stands of oak trees? Hard and soft masts where animals are going to feed, right? Like beach stands or concentrations. Ridge lines. and then looking at where the water and wetland areas are as far as wildlife significance.
Is that something that you, I mean, you just kind of, I envision you just laid out the work plan right there.
And that's me kind of not coming up with it on the spot, right? Because I've been thinking about this, but it's it's something that I started putting in motion in Burlington, and my energy and current work has mainly been around teaching tracking and engaging people in that side of things, and then kind of dabbling on the side in some of this planning through my work in like land trusts and with Burlington, South Burlington, and so on. And then nagging at Jens, and then Andy Wood, who works with Jens's team at the state.
Yep.
Just saying like, how are you actually deciding where those priority crossings are going on the map, right? It's all done from kind of high, distant, overhead view.
How many years have you been at this?
Tracking or
just this general,
this general line of everything. I've been studying and then working as a professional tracker since 2016. After dabbling more casually for some years, but my background's in environmental science and the field naturalist program at UVM as a grad student, and I've been working since fresh out of undergrad as a park ranger, outdoor educator, natural resource planner.
So in that
all of those things since 2008.
5-6 years and going back, what have you seen? Are there trend lines? What's your observation about the direction and obstacles, and however you want to answer the question? It's pretty broad and open.
Sure. The obstacles to what?
Well, I'm just saying, what is your assessment? Are we headed in the right direction? Are we doing some good things? Are there, you butting your head up against stuff? Like, what's your gut feeling about how where are we in regions, towns, the state? Are we making progress?
Okay.
Are we heading in the right direction?
Who's we? I think it's a great step in my books that the state, like that Act 171 passed, and that forest fragmentation is something that's having to be written into town plans, and depending on the town, I'm sure it's causing a lot of headaches, because I think towns are at different stages, but I think if you got funding and surveyed every town in Vermont, I don't think anyone's really figured it out, right? Like, here are the wildlife corridors for sure. It's a tough thing to delineate, and because I think human values do come into play. Like, even if you could have all the wildlife having their voices at the table, right, they're not going to agree on what's the important habitat there, but based on I guess we can layer our values as well, and then also try to come up with something that preserves as much habitat as possible for as many species as possible. And I think Act 171, that focus on forests and forest connectivity, is going to help get us there. But I think everybody, as far as I can tell, I'm newly back to Vermont a year ago after 2 years away, and so I feel like I've come back into it, and it's like, everyone's trying to figure it out right now. And
the sense I have is that we're further along, as Vermont sometimes tends to be kind of a little further out ahead than other places. Would you say that's fair assessment?
As far as preserving wildlife corridors or habitat, I would say generally Vermonters value that and have a relationship with the land, and I would say that we're getting there, but there's pressures, and then you wonder too, and I think that this work becomes vitally important when you think about changing climate and potential migration. Vermont's a relatively safe place to be, right? I think many towns and counties in Vermont are considered some of the safest in the country, like in the top 10 as far as climate change threats, and protection from flooding and drought and major natural disasters. And so you have to think that this pressure, right, and there's potential for so much migration and a greater influx of people in the future.
Yes, it's already happening.
Right. And so that's why I think it's vitally important to
get a handle on it.
To get a handle on it now. And
the work scope that you just described a few minutes ago, is that something that could be achieved within the time frame of a municipal planning grant, like a year to a year and a half? It sounded like a lot of it was remote sensing based, and then some ground truthing.
Yeah, time on the ground. I would say that in a year's timeline, sure, and obviously, that kind of constraint might dictate, a concentration of field days in 1 year versus spreading it out, or whether you rely on citizen scientists versus a trained professional, or, a number of trained professionals. So but yes, I would say so.
Okay.
Another possibility is to do phase 1
Right.
and phase 2, and so phase 1 might be from a different sourcing group. The New England Grassroots Association, I think it's called, really would like the point that you were making, I forget your name.
Carolyn,
Really wants participation, but otherwise I think they would really bite on the things that you're talking about if you could keep, so if you have these 3 prongs. And for that, and I'm not sure, Kristen, how much money they give. They did help fund us.
New England Grassroots.
Yeah. But my guess is if it were a multi-town with that perspective, that's got to be in there really heavily.
The engagement of the public. Yeah.
But that's part of what we're talking about.
Right.
Yeah.
And we've had that in the library and the town hall. We've been sort of circling around those ideas for a while.
I'll throw out a 4th prong, or of your 3, an A, B in one of those, and that's what is it, the Lois McClure? There's a woman up in Shelburne area or so, and I don't know all of the scope of their grants, but I think there's a lot of private granting sources that would be really gung-ho to get behind this type of stuff, and to know that it was a municipal community effort. So I wouldn't rule that out at all.
Are you by chance Dave?
I'm Dave from New Haven.
From New Haven. Thank you for coming. I'm Kristen Underwood.
Hi, Kristen.
I
got
I'm
here
sorry,
a little late.
just for the minutes, what's your last name? Your last name?
Your last name,
My
Dave?
last name is Lewis, L-E-W-I-S.
Lewis, okay.
From the New Haven Conservation Commission.
Yeah. Take a step forward into
Yeah,
this.
you can, if you like,
this,
Now that the sun's gone down, it's a
Yeah.
good place to sit.
Ellie from New Haven was just sitting there. She just left a few minutes before you. We just missed each other.
By the way, I used to be a New Haven resident, and I think it's the Conservation Commission that puts on the armchair talks.
Yes.
I mean, for years and years, it's well over a decade. Phenomenal. So thank you for being here, and thank you for having...
I just wanted to listen in, make sure I had the right group.
I ran across a website called protectourwildlifevermont.org. Has anyone heard of this? They say that it's a team of volunteers comprised of biologists, wildlife rehabilitators, educators, and other professionals who seek better protections for wildlife. We collaborate with nonprofits, both local and national, to ensure that all are working together to offer the best outcomes.
Well, that was just on Front Porch Forum, wasn't it?
I don't remember where I saw it, but I have the website. We could put it in our notes, but it looks like, who are these people? And really, they'll help us? We collaborate with nonprofits. We monitor wildlife legislation and rulemaking in an effort to keep the public informed and also ensure enforcement of existing laws and rules. It seems like there are a lot in terms of
I think they walk around with
trapping,
capes.
hunting.
I was gonna say, yeah.
Is it
My
more
sense of that group is it
superheroes?
might be like an activist or lobbying group around hunting, trapping, those kinds of things.
Got
which-
it. Interesting.
I
They
think
couch
we're
it in
thinking-
ways that don't make that
But I
obvious.
don't know for sure, but it's worth looking into.
Protect our wildlife, Vermont. Yeah.
Maybe.
Well, no, I was just gonna ask, and I'm just curious to know from all of you, like if what your sense of wildlife corridors is, if any, for your town, or if you know other local experts, right? Because that's something that I'm always sensitive to in coming into a place, right? Like I spent only a handful of visits, to Bristol, so yeah, I'm curious to know where you think the local expertise lies, if it's there.
There's a number
Like
of
certain people? Or
folks.
certain,
People,
there's definitely
groups, community resources.
Certainly, Lewis Creek Association originally, we did reach out to them and ask if they wanted to be a part of this effort, and they declined. They've got some other priorities that are happening right now.
What about the regional
Planning Commission.
RCP? Not Angela Rowe, the one with all the Conservation Commission.
The Association of Vermont Conservation Commissions?
No. This is where they had the meeting
the
in
regional,
Bristol.
Laura.
The regional, yeah.
Laura in
What does she
Moncton
do? What is that?
heads up
She's
a
got
regional
an acronym, I
group
can't think
of conservation commissions in Madison County, and they are also, and you may know more, they're also here to help, here to fundraise, here to coordinate towns, efforts across towns. I can get you her contact
Did
information.
you go to that meeting?
I did go to that meeting over
I know,
Zoom.
I can't remember what
And
they're
that was
called.
6 weeks ago, and I don't honestly remember any action items that came out of it.
I just thought of a source of data that I think is totally ignored, which is roadkill.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Do people report
Yeah.
when city people go in and scoop up the raccoon off the side of the road? Do they report
Or the
where
game
that
warden.
was?
Yeah, I think imperfectly recorded, but yeah, I've been actually meaning to reach out to game wardens and get more specificity. Bridget Butler, who many people know as the bird diva,
Yeah.
she worked at Cold Holiday Canada, which is a nonprofit I also work for now up in the northern Green Mountains, initiated a wild paths project on iNaturalist, and so that's looking to gather roadkill data. It was a tough one to engage people in. Like Cold Holiday Canada, that are a nonprofit up there that's looking at forest connectivity across 7 towns, was engaging groups of volunteers to like go out and monitor and go looking for roadkill, and it's a little dispiriting, right, when you're reporting the bear that's been hit on the road, but I think that, you know, having it in people's minds, and that's something that I'm always looking for, right? Like, oh yeah, I need to get down that porcupine that's
There's the
near my
corridor
house.
on River Road. I see roadkill there once a week.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I know there's
That seems like a really good source
And,
of
and that's what I
information.
mean, the community resources too, right? Where I think it's a like kind of fact-finding mission, like coming in, doing some tracking on the ground. But when I come in, I want to talk to trackers, hunters, trappers, game wardens.
Yeah.
You know, like who are those networks? And often they're not the same people who are showing up at conservation commission meetings and the like. And I think that there's just so much potential to.
That's what I'm saying about thinking about who we can bring to the table. Like, how do we get those voices and find them where they are? You know.
For example, Pete Lossman on Carlstrom Road is a trapper and very knowledgeable and a hunter and would have some information.
And you, concerned Bristol citizen, what are your interests here?
Well, just to update the wildlife studies, and we found that it was 20 years old overdue. And just thinking of different groups in Bristol, you have your foresters for the 2 big logging industries here, A. Johnson, Lathrop's. You have one of the biggest farms in Vermont, Fort Hills Farm, the Hill family. They employ so many people that see so much wildlife day in and day out when they're in the fields working.
Definitely.
I thought of another group too, and I forget offhand, but just to identify where everything is, because I travel the state and see our area shrinking due to overpopulation and development. And Williston's a great area. That was all farmland 25 years ago when I graduated high school.
Exactly.
And now it's just huge.
Yeah.
And there's no stopping it.
Right.
So just to identify that wildlife and preserve what Vermont is.
The road crews too, I would imagine.
Absolutely.
Our road crews know the network.
There's backcountry hunters.
Yeah, that group too.
Say that one
What'd you
again?
say?
Backcountry hunters and anglers. Generally has a.
We're coming into the biggest time of year when data is going to be collected.
Yeah.
Right.
Immensely.
Yeah.
People are starting to hang their cameras.
Well, bear hunting has already started.
Yeah, September
Do
1st.
hunters have to report exactly where they got it? Or just, it was
Not
on
exactly. It's the wildlife.
Yeah.
The wildlife management unit that it.
But wouldn't that be helpful?
It would be. A lot of that data is collected from the harvest when you have to tag a large game animal, turkey, bear, bobcat, moose.
But they would also, I mean, those hunters that are out there with game cameras would see a lot more than just the game that they're after.
Yeah.
Like the bobcats and also
Exactly.
things
Yep.
that are not.
Which, you're totally right. The game cameras are going up.
This is like
And the technology.
I know.
is-
Why is that?
The worst one for him. Should just
He can watch it on DTV. He can
That's
catch
right.
up.
Yeah, he can watch it and then he can comment to us
Yeah, he'll
afterwards.
have a lot to say.
The technology has advanced so much over the last 5 years on what cameras can do and where they can send pictures to, and it's just so that data is going to be there.
Yeah.
It's getting the hunter to say where that picture was taken.
Right.
If it's just, hey, I took this picture, it was here, but not publicized.
But could you say
Right.
from which forest patch or something like that? I wonder
I-
what.
I think in Bristol in general,
Mhm.
Hunters already
those
know.
trophy deer are not here. Vermont's very terrible at managing their deer herd, in my opinion. That deer aren't allowed to grow 3.5, 4.5, 5 years. They're
Right.
harvested a year and a half to 2 years
Right.
into their lifespan, or killed on the road. And so that's a whole different topic. But
Yeah.
those trophy deer, yeah, you'll get a nice 6, 8, 10 pointer, but there's no match like if you go out west,
Right.
where you're looking for that trophy Boone and Crockett or Pope and Young deer.
Right.
So
Yeah. And Bristol's also unique, as you know, probably that a lot of our aerial footage or acreage is Green Mountain National Forest.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there I imagine there's some level of protection, as you were saying before. We might want to focus more of our efforts on the non-national forest areas for priority crossings.
And even when somehow I don't have the corridor map in my sitting in the other ones, but
yeah,
here I have it. But a lot of locations were
But you can
identified,
look.
like across 116 as north-south corridors,
Right.
And I think there's more potential to hone in on the east-west connections too, towards some of those smaller forest patches,
Right.
like especially towards the north end of town. And so that's where, like those town boundaries kind of come into play, because obviously as you head northwards,
It's up in the mountain.
there's more territory to
There's
explore
I just said
there.
those, was it secondary roads, right?
Right.
Like
Just
those
thinking
are starting to
broadly.
get so much. There's so many houses being built up.
Yeah, so trying to maintain some connections to those smaller forest patches, getting on the ground and seeing what does that look like as far as culverts and hedgerows and bridges and riparian crossings and all of that. That as far as improving some of those under crossings too, like that's something that's happening on a state level, right? Like as funding becomes available or when infrastructure needs to be replaced, but even having a sense of, oh, actually, this bridge should have a wider crossing, or maybe a culvert this big needs to be replaced. That's some of the monitoring I was doing out in the Pacific Northwest, was looking at spots where I-90 goes through the Cascades, and they turned areas that were a culvert like this into a, I think 3 times the width of or length of this picnic shelter, open stream with tons of shoreline underneath, kind of underpassage of the highway, and then over crossings too.
Cool.
I know at a town scale we're not about to put wildlife overpasses over the roads or anything like that, but
I think 50% of Bristol's roads are already dirt roads, so I don't know.
Yeah,
that's gonna work.
And I think it is tricky, right, trying to ask hunters to give, well, no one's asking hunters to give up their secret spots. I think there's actually a lot of qualitative information that can come in from that community that's really valuable, and especially, one person's opinion of this patch of woods is especially important is one thing, but if multiple people agree on that, I think there's power to that. Even if it's not based on any numbers, but just a personal sense from people who spend a lot of time in the woods. It's when it comes down to needing to pinpoint those locations, I think it's where road crossings are coming into play, and trying to be as precise as possible. And especially if anything's going to result in, say, an overlay district, right? And people are going to be fighting for what's included or what's excluded, because that influences what can be done on their property going into the future. I think we need to really have a lot to stand on. So asking people to be very specific when it comes to road crossing points, maybe certain other places of interest, but otherwise I think you can also collect more kind of qualitative data.
Yeah.
Are you familiar with Jens Hilke?
Yes, we've been talking about
Okay, so has Susan, I don't know, I'm coming in the middle here.
Sure.
We're new to this,
Yeah.
as you know, but did she discuss what we did this spring with
Yes,
Jens?
that Jens had identified kind of in a pre-filter way some key
Yeah, and there were
spots for you to
aerial
monitor.
aerial photos. So
Got it.
we drove around with them
Okay.
in the rain.
Yeah.
Just throw that in. And they found out that some of the things they had marked were actually on somebody's property, or
Okay.
he was looking for crossings.
Yep.
He was looking for contiguous, if there was shelter here and shelter here, is this going to be a crossing area?
Yeah.
So if it ever comes up that property is being looked at for development, we've got some data about not separating the habitat like we have there.
Yeah.
Okay, so I just
Cool.
bring this so forth.
I saw a great cartoon. Instead of asking why is the deer crossing the road, the question is why is the road going through this forest? The road is intersected with the forest. The deer's it's just another way to look at it.
And I think, and that's such a useful, we've kind of been talking about that approach, right, or versions of that approach of just getting on the ground, looking at where forest connects on either side of the road. That's pretty much what's informing what the state's doing at a statewide scale, and then very few people, very few conservation commissions have gone through a whole process of then verifying those, and especially if say there's 100, even 1,000, probably hundreds of potential road crossings of forest on either side of the road, or maybe long stretches along certain roads. How do you then hone in on those ones that you're going to really, really stand up to protect versus? I mean, it's funny to ask, like, how's Vermont doing? Like, you almost have to say, like, well, there's going to be some level of development, or we're not going to win every conservation fight if it is a fight, right? So, like, where does wildlife really stand primary, or like the value of a certain crossing? I think it can come down to like more concentrated versus more dispersed, or just what species are present.
So we'd like to try to wrap up at 7:30. It's 7:15 right now. Maybe we could talk about maybe like next steps, sort of a action plan going forward, if that or things to do before we can have an action plan, or let's think about what progress can we make from this meeting? Like, what can we do now?
Here to now, instead of all these pie in the sky.
No, I know. I could talk. We should talk about this all day.
So all the data.
What kind of funding? What kind of communication? What's our goal or next steps? Whatever anyone thinks.
Is there? I'm just looking at our Bristol map, and a lot of this land is in national forest, right? And so maybe we wouldn't necessarily focus there so much, but instead in this part of our town, which joins with New Haven. And I wonder, would there be any sort of scope that you could develop for us for an area that overlaps a part of Bristol but also a part of New Haven, that for those two towns, I guess your service would be like doing that desktop analysis first, and maybe zeroing in on some crossing locations, and also relying on the ones that Jens identified for New Haven.
Another thing I forgot to mention is that he had us focusing on 6 target species.
Okay.
The deer weren't one of them.
I agree. I don't think we need to, I don't know if folks agree, but I don't think we need to track deer.
Yeah, it was otter, moose, bear, fisher, mink, bobcat.
Okay.
And I didn't really ask him why, but I just said, okay, that's what we'll do.
I could tell you, if I had to choose a top 6, those would be my 6 too.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I'm
your umbrella
glad to hear that. Is umbrella species and like forest dwellers and and riparian or stream dwelling species too.
Can we list those again for the minutes? Could you say those again? Do you remember?
Yes, otter, moose, bear, fisher, mink, bobcat.
You all know the saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? Where I'm leaning is education. And it hasn't, I haven't really heard the word yet tonight, but from little kids to, a moose came right across my driveway, and I was...
My dad saw one right there. We just saw that right there, over there.
And I was enthralled, and I think people, when they have a first-hand encounter, even if it's in a slideshow with wildlife, it can't help but impact you, and we need to do more of that somehow, because we have to enlist people and get their little kid part of them to kind of come out. And so I think, again, New Haven has done a tremendous job with those armchair talks, but we have to somehow make this a bigger invitation and a community kind of setting.
And you may not be aware, but we haven't done it in a few years, but since Pete was around, but we have done a number of talks at Holly Hall with Sue Morse at one, Bridget Butler at one,
those are all
Vin's at another.
Yeah.
So, and they were all super well attended, standing room only, and so I think we could pick those up again.
Yeah, I mean, we have a limited budget, but I think we could, you know, figure
We could tie that into this whole
Right,
effort.
and then, you know, and have maps and have people, you know, talk to us about those before
Yep.
and after or something.
Yeah.
And I'll just add this, when I learned that the one that eats all those ticks. Possum. Like, who knows anything about a possum? And with all the tick problems, I was like, I want some top possums around my property.
Like, how do I make that habitat?
But the bigger part of it is, like, there's so much interconnectivity with all sorts of as you said, critters, animals. Like, once you understand that concept, you could slight this over, you know, over that, but they're all completely interconnected, and everything has a place. Just like, oh well, I only like this kind of fruit or this kind of vegetable, whatever. No, they all have something that they're providing.
Possums are always the roadkill.
Yeah, they often are, for sure.
Oh, and I feel so completely like devastated now when I see a possum like on the side. It's kind of crazy, but
is that something that you could like just give us a quick work plan for, kind of, so we know what kind of funding we need to raise in order to?
Yeah.
Or if we wrote a grant, like, would you be willing to
Who's
look at
available?
draft or suggestions?
Yeah, absolutely. And one, I feel like I almost need to apologize because one place that I'm not really well versed in is knowing where the funding comes for this kind of stuff, right? So municipal planning grants or other funding sources, I know it's a different picture for every town, but I'm just not in that world right now. You know, as far as teaching tracking, I mean, I'm happy to, you know, investigate and, you know, spend some time looking into funding sources because I, you know, care personally about this work happening, whether I'm doing it or somebody else is doing it, right? It's just, you know, important work for towns to be doing. But in the next 2 weeks, I'd be happy to kind of detail options, let's say, like a menu of different project options. Cool. And like, you know, maybe like an idealized scenario of like, you know, here's the most that you could collect about a town or, you know, your town's wildlife, and then you know, something that speaks to, yeah, working with public engagement, potential school engagement, or just, you know, different directions to go. Or like, you know, if you were to hire me or another, or well, I say, I'll obviously lay it out what it could look like working with me specifically, because I don't know about other consultants that you could work with. Yeah, you know, what I could do and what that might look like. So just trying to lay out some options, and then hopefully that'll give you a place to start, compare, see if there's grant sources that you can match it to, and then go from there. And obviously, if you have follow-up questions, I'm happy to continue to be a resource.
Armchair naturalist, just ours first one is going to be on the 21st. It's going to be in Front Porch Forum, and it's Jacqueline Como, who is the bear person for Vermont Fish and Wildlife.
Oh,
She's
cool.
got a presentation. It's going to be Zoom, and we talked about money, and she said, "Oh, don't worry about that. I don't charge."
Wow.
So,
Well, that's when did you say that was?
Yeah, right.
First.
I was trying to buy the seat.
So that seems a little earlier than usual, is that right? Or will you kind of kick off in September?
We're just rocking and rolling.
Wow. Wow.
Yeah, well, we kind of teamed up with the pollinator group.
Yeah.
And we've sponsored a couple of their groups and a couple of their field trips, and there's one coming up on the 17th, which is going to be interesting. That'll be in Front Porch Forum. But we had already booked. I had talked to Jacqueline 2 months ago, and I said, well, when's going to be our first meeting? And Cheryl said, just book it for the 21st of September. That's when we'll start.
Wow.
Okay.
What kind of budget are you guys working with?
Yeah, very slim.
Pretty
A
slim.
couple hundred?
Yeah.
A few hundred?
You know, we haven't had a formal meeting. I don't know what's in there.
But you make it work. That's great. All right.
Well, Zoom helps a lot, because they're just
Zoom
sitting in
helps
their
a lot,
kitchen.
yes.
You might have to pay for coffee or something.
I'm not sure who gets credit for it, but I know that during COVID, the Bristol Conservation Commission had a scavenger hunt, and so kids were kind of the primary, I think, interested parties, but their parents, right?
Yeah.
Really, so it was a great merging of, you know, parents supporting their kids, you know, wanting to do the scavenger hunt, and there was some other version
The
of it.
retirement community all did it too.
Oh,
Remember?
fun.
They did the birds.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it was thank you note of them.
And I just think
It's like a
those
bingo,
things,
find a bird.
they
Yeah.
probably do more than we realize. but we can, you know, build on those type of things.
Well, it's great to get the kids. That's
Yeah.
the key.
Yeah.
The kids involved.
Right. I mean, that's what's coming up, but we also have to hit it now hard with, you know, those, the powers that be, right, on the select boards and the planning commissions and this and that, so, yeah. Multitask front.
Nice.
In the meantime, we should all just start writing down roadkills, right? That's a source of,
Or download iNaturalist and start putting sightings on the Wild Paths project.
Can you do roadkills though?
Yeah, and so I mean, iNaturalist, you can do anything. iNaturalist, a sighting, a track, scat, a roadkill. But I think the power in iNaturalist too comes from if you tag it to the project and then somebody can go and say like, I want to know where roadkill is in Vermont, and then that's going to pop up. So cool. And iNaturalist is just so great that you get your phone out, it'll tag the coordinates, and then you're good to go.
Yep.
Snap a photo, so it just makes it so easy.
That's great. That's cool. Thank you very much for coming out to
Yes,
this Thanksgiving drive.
Thank you all
Font
for
of information.
Thank you for putting your attention towards.
And thank you so much for coming out from New
corridors.
Haven and Cornwall too, and the community. We really appreciate your involvement.
Well, I apologize for being late. I really am not good at reading directions.
And you were told at all
6 p.m. Susan said, I can't make it, but it's at 7, so I'm not going to.
Remember, we showed up to go do some workshop.
Right.
And Susan had the wrong time.
Oh,
And we
you're
missed
right.
it.
So anyway, it was clear that once I printed the agenda, it was right
Yeah.
there.
Susan's
So okay, wait, we're being adjourned, so you have to still listen to me. So so since we're still in session, we need to pick a meeting location, October 13th. It's 6 o'clock.
Well,
it's already a little
it
dark.
will be dark in an hour earlier.
And there's no lights in here. Do you want to do the conference room with a Zoom option? Do we want to do
You mean just the Valley Hall?
Yeah, we always had it for 20 years.
The regular.
The regular, are we comfortable with that?
Sure, because it's hybrid, so if anyone is ill or
Do you
feeling
want to
like
do hybrid?
I mean,
Last time we did hybrid, I was the only one who came. Now I refuse to do it ever again. The governor says we can be remote through January.
Okay.
We could go or hybrid, whatever you want. You can all weigh in.
I just know people who are still getting COVID.
October is. We could do remote again. October, we're gonna have Meredith McFarland from Rec Department.
Like, so we do want to separate email there.
I could ask Valerie about that, but we can't do hybrid with the owl upstairs.
No, right. If we just did the in-person.
We could do mass required.
Yeah, I was gonna say we could do mass.
Indoor, if that feels good. I would
wear a mask. I mean, I wouldn't ask anyone else to.
We could suggest please. We could just say please wear a mask at the meeting. We'll just say it in the. We'll just say when we announce it. Say mask required. What are they gonna do? No one reads our minutes except Amos. And you're fine with masks, right? He's fine.
And I was first looking to work with
okay, so Holly Hall is a Zoom option.
Wildlife sightings on the map. iNaturalist is great.
Sure.
That sounds great.
So many
that sounds
wildlife
great.
trackers.
We'll do it, and then we're
That
gonna
way,
have
like, there
Meredith.
still is a Zoom option, but
from like wildlife biology.
Yeah, I'll try to
like
look at that.
prioritize it.
So I'm gonna have Meredith's gonna come with the new Alex.
Okay. Freddie.
Great, thanks, Freddie. So you're gonna come. We'll talk about Frolf and talk about
Okay.
So okay, so does anyone like to make a motion?
I will make a motion.
Make the
This is me
motion.
taking the sea of blue dots that shows up on
She seconded
iNaturalist,
it.
'cause
We're done,
every
and we'll do all
shows
those
up as a blue
minutes
dot
and
and actually
Cool.
Beautiful.
putting them as unique.